Hey there. Welcome back to Nothing But Anime. It's time for part 3 of our What If Deku Had Powerful Weapon Quirk series. If you're having fun with the content, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more. Let's jump right in and see what happens next. Following the entrance exam, Izuku was a nervous wreck. Every day after getting home from school, he would run to the mailbox outside the apartment and check for anything from UA. That Friday, it had gotten to the point that Chishiki-sensei had to take him aside to her personal office. Midoriya, calm down. I'm sure you did just fine. But what if I didn't get enough points to pass? What if getting a quirk wasn't enough? Oh god. Am I gonna have to settle for Gen Ed? Chishiki-sensei grabbed him by the shoulders and gave him a quick shake. Midoriya, breathe. He stopped pulling at his hair and looked at her. I know for a fact that you did well. You're one of my top students, not just academically. If you didn't pass the entrance exam, then I swear that I will fucking eat my teaching license. Izuku sniffed, tears welling up in his eyes. You really think that highly of me? Yes, Midoriya. You are one of the best students I have ever had in my entire teaching career. You are an incredible joy to be around. You always give your best effort in class. And you always go out of your way to help other people. If that rat god doesn't give you a chance to be a hero, I swear I will walk up to his office and punch him in the face. Izuku's face went pale, and he started weaving his arms frantically. No, you don't need to do that over me. I'll be fine, I dash. Chishiki-sensei grabbed him firmly by the shoulders, and he stopped talking. Midoriya, you are worth it. I don't care what the fuck Aldera put in your head about your value as a person. None of it is true. You are a wonderful person, and I will be surprised if you don't reach the top 10 in the hero rankings within a year of your graduation. Izuku took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping a few inches. Thanks, sensei. I just couldn't help but worry. She patted him on the back. Don't sweat it. Can't have my best student ruining his grades because of overstress. I'll let your mom know that you need some time to unwind. I don't want to hear about you going out and training at any point this weekend, you hear me? You need a mental health break. Izuku tossed up a mock salute. Yes, ma'am. Will that be all, ma'am? Chishiki-sensei snorted and slapped him on the back. There's the Midoriya I know and love. Go on, get back to your friends. They're probably wondering if they need to strap you to your bed and force you to watch cat videos. A snort came from the doorway, and Izuku turned to see Katsuki standing there. Funnily enough, that was our first idea. I guess you beat us to him. Huh. Chishiki-sensei nodded and pushed Izuku in the back, sending him stumbling into Katsuki's arms. Get that boy home and de-stressed. I'll let your teachers know that I prescribed him 12 hours of forced R&R. Katsuki chuckled. Pretty sure you can't fucking prescribe something unless you're a doctor. But whatever. Apparently, Mom had noticed Izuku's steady decline, so she was ready and waiting when he and Katsuki showed up at the apartment. The moment he opened the door, she immediately dragged him to the living room and plopped him down on the couch, wrapping him in his favorite all-night blanket and handing him a steaming cup of hot chocolate. Before he could protest, she'd stuck his computer on his lap, already open to his favorite cat compilation. It only took a few seconds before he sighed, the tension bleeding out of his shoulders as he practically melted into the couch. Katsuki sat down next to him and wrapped him in a tight hug, while Mom bustled around in the kitchen, likely prepping Katsudon for dinner. Thanks. I needed this. Katsuki huffed warmly. You're shitty at hiding your problems, nerd. This was gonna happen eventually. Just be thankful that we caught it and nipped it in the bud before it started affecting your grades. Izuku's phone dinged, but before he could read the notification, Katsuki had swiped it out of his hands. Katsuki-I. Gimme Thayet. No. You are not allowed to look at your phone unless it's something I deem safe for you. Auntie, back me up here. Mom called. Izuku. Until specified otherwise, Katsuki is now in charge of your screen time. You are to only look at pre-approved cat videos and messages from your friends. Katsuki will handle all other notifications. Izuku sighed, before wrapping his hands around his mug of hot chocolate and sinking back into the couch. Fine. Katsuki smirked and patted him on the head, before turning to Izuku's phone and checking the notification. Oh, it's just Bo's wondering where you went. No, you don't need to do anything. I'm perfectly capable of updating her on the situation myself. You just sit there like a good boy, watch your cat videos, and drink your hot chocolate. Izuku pouted and slumped against the back of the couch. Alright, I get it. No thinking for the baby. Kyuka glanced down as her phone dinged. She plugged one of her jacks into it and listened to the automated voice read out the notification. She had Izuku to thank for that idea. Sighing with relief, she glanced over at Fumikage and made a beckoning motion with her finger. Dark shadow popped out from the boy's shirt and slid across the floor, coming up right next to Kyuka's desk. So, what's the situation with Izuku? Apparently, he was stressing over the possibility of failing the entrance exam. Chishiki-sensei, Katsuki, and Midoriya had to stage an intervention and force him to de-stress. He's currently sitting on his couch watching cat videos and drinking hot chocolate. Katsuki confiscated his phone for the foreseeable future. Dark shadow huffed. I knew something was up with him. Thank goodness they caught it before it got any worse. Huh? Kyuka nodded and turned her attention back to the board before Banga-sensei could accuse her of not paying attention to the lesson on complementary and supplementary angles. In the back of her mind, She could hear Dark Shadow relaying information to Fumikage, before retreating back under the boy's shirt. Fumikage glanced over at her, and she tossed him a quick thumbs up before focusing back on the board. She heard Mineta mutter under his breath. Oh, so when us regular people get stressed, we're told to man up and deal with it. But when Mr. Precious starts worrying if he passed a little test or not, he's allowed to go home early and be excused from schoolwork? Talk about a teacher's pet. Right then and there, Kyuka swore to herself that one day she was going to grind that bastard into a fine paste, stuff him into a wine bottle, and then get Uraraka to chuck the bottle into orbit. Izuku was a smart enough person to admit when he was wrong. He knew that he'd been getting overly stressed, and he really needed the time to unwind and calm down. He knew he probably would have gone crazy if Chishiki-sensei hadn't forced him to go home early on Friday for his own mental health. He also knew that he could be forgiven for devolving into a panicked mess when he noticed the letter from Yue in Saturday's mail. As soon as Mom heard his hyperventilating, she immediately came over, picked him up, and dropped him on the couch, wrapping him in a blanket before going back outside to the mailbox. As he curled up there, clutching the blanket like a lifeline, she calmly walked in and sorted the mail into different piles on the dining room table, before taking the letter from Yue and setting it on the coffee table in front of the couch. Well, sweetie, it's not going to get any better if you wait. Go on, open it. Izuku reached out with trembling hands and picked up the envelope, popping the wax seal with his thumbnail. He reached in and took out 2 items, a folded letter and a hologram projector. Mom calmly took the items from his hands, setting the letter to one side before placing the projector on the coffee table and turning it on. A video of All Might appeared and shouted, "Greetings, young Midoriya. I am here to deliver your exam results. In the written exam, you scored an impressive 99%. Not an easy feat without the help of an intelligence quirk. In addition, you scored a whopping 76 villain points in the practical exam, more than enough to qualify for the hero course normally." Izuku panicked. Was there something I didn't know about? Oh god. What if I failed because I didn't satisfy a hidden condition? However, recently, Yue has added a secret point system to help out those with less combative quirks. Rescue points. After all, what is a hero if not someone who saves people? For your heroic actions in the entrance exam, you have been awarded an additional 80 rescue points. Izuku's breath caught in his throat. What? Congratulations, young Midoriya. You have passed Yue's entrance exam with 156 points, making you the top scorer this year, even beating out my old record of 110 points. Izuku brought his hand up to his mouth, tears forming in his eyes. You mean I? Young Midoriya. Welcome to your Hero Academia. The hologram shut off, and the 2 Midoriyas sat there in stunned silence for a few seconds. Suddenly, Izuku threw off his blanket and screeched triumphantly, and Mom jumped up and wrapped him in a bear hug. Izuku, you did it. You're going to UA. I did it, Mom. I'm going to be a hero. Shishiki-sensei, of course, was smug beyond belief. I told you I knew for a fact you'd get in. I still keep in contact with the rat god, after all. I knew the exam results, but I couldn't say anything until the letters had been sent out. Katsuki clapped him on the back the moment the two saw each other in person. Told you, Zuku. You're a fucking boss. We promised to be heroes together, after all. Dark Shadow had wrapped him in a tight hug as soon as Izuku took one step into the classroom. I'm so sorry we didn't notice sooner. We totally could have helped you unwind before it got too bad. Fumikage wasn't quite as emotional, but he offered his apologies for not noticing, and assured Izuku that he would be more vigilant in the future. Kyuka was close to tears, wrapping Izuku's hand with one of her jacks and dragging him over to her desk. Always tell us when you're stressed in the future, alright? Never think that you have to keep your problems to yourself. She then proceeded to pull him into a hug, causing most of the class to either turn red or let out wolf whistles. Mineta simply grumbled and buried his nose in his homework. Once she released him, Izuku stumbled back to his desk and sat down, his entire face one deep red blush. Kyuka wasn't much better, her face buried in her hands and constantly making squeaking noises. Chishiki-sensei walked in, looked at the expressions of everyone assembled, and decided to just move on in her own blunt way. Well, those of you who took the UA entrance exam, I'm sure you've gotten your results back by now. Those of you who got in, congratulations. Those of you who didn't, oh well, you'll always have other opportunities. Whether that's other hero schools or other career paths is up to you. Mineta coughed into his fist and rubbed it against his chest, leaning back in his seat and wearing a smug grin. Shishiki-sensei continued, by the way, passing doesn't ensure your spot in the hero course, especially you poor saps in 1A. Your behavior for the remainder of the school year can potentially have your attendance revoked, and one, as homeroom teacher is notorious for expelling those who he believes don't live up to his standards. So don't feel safe. Mineta just continued looking smug. Izuku and Kyuka had since recovered from their respective blushes, and were currently glaring at the grape with barely concealed disdain. As was most of the class, really. The boy had made a reputation for himself at Mizutofu Junior High for using his mom's position on UA's school board to get himself out of whatever trouble he ended up in, and said reputation hardly endeared him to most of the students and faculty. Of course, he completely misinterpreted the reason for their disgust, believing them to either be jealous of his quirk or literally looking down on him for his lack of height. Shishiki-sensei cleared her throat, bringing everyone's attention back to the front. Still, regardless of the results of the entrance exam, you all are still my students, and this is still a school. You are not excused from lessons just because you've been accepted to a high school. Your grades can impact your attendance just as much as your behavior. As such, I expect you all to continue giving your assignments as much effort as you have so far this year. Am I clear? They chorused. Yes, Chishiki-sensei. She nodded. Good. Glancing up at the clock, she sighed and closed her folder, picking it up and holding it by her side. Hate to sound like a broken record, but we're out of time for homeroom. Class dismissed. The bell rang just as she walked out. The class got up and started filtering out the door, though most students tossed glances at Izuku and Kyuka before they left. Katsuki simply turned around in his seat, leaning on the back of his chair and grinning at Izuku. Gee willikers, Zooks, I didn't know you had a tech kink. Izuku's blush returned in full force, and he slammed his face into his desk, the impact actually making the surrounding empty desks jump a couple centimeters into the air. Fumikage chuckled as he walked over. For once, I agree with the Bomberanian. Your feelings clearly go far beyond simple friendship, do they not? Kyuka buried her face in her hands and whimpered. Katsuki's grin widened. Oh, come off it, you two. This has been a long time coming. Ever since Zuko stepped in and stood up to Bose's primary bully. She probably had the hots for him the entire time. It's just neither of you had the balls to open up and admit it. A loud gagging sound came from the back of the room, and the four of them glanced over at where Mineta was sitting. Oh my god. Can you not? Honestly, it's disgusting that sensei lets you four get away with everything. Like, can you possibly be more of a teacher's pet? Sheesh. Izuku and Kyuka glared at the short boy as he stood up and strutted out of the room, oblivious to their anger. As soon as the door slid shut behind Mineta, all four of them said in unison, I'm gonna squash that fucking grape the first chance I get. Izuku glanced up at the massive building sitting before them. 2 months later, and it only feels more impressive, doesn't it? Kyuka nodded, her hand intertwined with his. Well, it's not gonna get any less impressive while we stand here gawking. Come on, let's get to class. You remember where 1A's room is, right? Izuku scoffed. Child's play, at least compared to some of the work Chishiki-sensei would assign us. Kyuka snorted. More like the work she would assign you. I totally noticed her giving you high school level work during the last month of junior high. And you still aced it like the genius you are. Izuku chuckled, and the two of them started forward. Thankfully, there wasn't a loose brick to trip on this time, and they continued into the main building uninterrupted. Izuku quickly took the lead, navigating his way through the various halls until they stood in front of a 10-foot-tall door marked 1A. Well, we're here. Shall we? Kyuka lightly elbowed him. Do we do this normally, or do we go for the dramatic entrance? Izuku grinned. What do you think, babe? They locked their hands in place and stepped forward, Izuku catching the door with his right hand and sliding it open in a practiced maneuver. The two of them spun into the room together, catching the attention of everyone inside. Izuku stopped in front of the teacher's podium, allowing Kyuka to spin in place before he dipped her into a passionate kiss. Izuku could hear the wolf whistles and clapping from around the room, as well as a shocked gasp and a pained groan. They split apart, and Izuku pulled Kyuka upright with a grin, turning to face the class and gauge their reactions. Several people standing near the front were clapping in approval. Izuku spotted Kaminari and Kirishima, who Katsuki had introduced him to over the break, though the red hair was new, standing with a pink-skinned girl who was cackling madly. A blonde boy wearing a fancy belt had his hands on his cheeks and sparkles in his eyes. The blue-haired boy from the entrance exam had his jaw hanging open and his hand raised as though he was about to karate chop some sense into both of them. Katsuki was smirking and nodding in approval. And of course, the reaction they were hoping for, Mineta was sitting near the back of the room and looking absolutely disgusted. And here I was hoping I'd get away from your stupid PDA here. Izuku grinned and wrapped his arm around Kyuka's waist, bringing her in closer. Too bad, buddy. You're stuck with us now. Ochako walked up with a grin on her face. So, you two finally figured out you liked each other and got together over the break? About time. Izuku grinned and rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly, a slight blush on his face. Yeah, it actually took Mom locking us both in my room until we confessed our feelings. But on the plus side, at least we have new material to bug Mineta with. Chako snorted. Yeah, that's definitely a plus. Kyuka tapped Izuku's lower back, and he turned towards the door, having picked up on the same thing she had. Hi there, Aizawa-san. Do you always make yourself look like a caterpillar? Or is this a special occasion? All attention was drawn to the bright yellow sleeping bag laying in the doorway. Aizawa-san sighed and stood upright, allowing the bag to fall to the floor by his ankles. Well, I guess I can't be too surprised. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Aizawa Shoyuta. I'll be your homeroom teacher this year. He pulled a bunch of uniforms from his bag and tossed them on the podium. Get changed and get outside to the training field. I don't tolerate slackers. He glanced at Izuku and Kyuka. Keep the PDA to a reasonable amount. So long as it doesn't interrupt your work, I won't have a problem with it. The man turned on his heel and left, dragging his sleeping bag behind him. Izuku and Kyuka reached over and grabbed one uniform each, before splitting apart and heading towards the locker rooms, albeit still side by side. This spurred the rest of the class into action, and they followed, with Katsuki and Fumikage leading the pack and Ochako bringing up the rear, making sure to stay behind Mineta. The 5 of them were out on the training field in about 5 minutes, followed closely by the teen with split hair and the girl with her black hair in a ponytail. Kaminari and Kirishima showed up at about the 8-minute mark, and the rest of the class had trickled out after 10 minutes. Once Mineta had finally swaggered onto the field, Aizawa-sensei raised his voice to address the entire class. Most of you took over 10 minutes to get out here. That is unacceptable. Out in the field, hundreds of innocent people could have died in those 10 minutes. As a hero, you learn to make every second count. In other news, we're holding a Quirk apprehension test. Ochako raised her hand. Sir? What about orientation? Heroes don't have time to waste on frivolities. Any important information covered during orientation is also covered in your syllabi, so I recommend looking through it once we're done here. But back on topic. You've already done these tests in middle school, but the Ministry of Education likes to waste time by making you do them quirkless. Izuku deftly caught the ball tossed his way with his right hand. Midoriya, you got first on the entrance exam, right? What was your score for the softball throw in middle school? 65 meters, I think. You know the drill. Stand in the circle and throw that as hard as you can. But this time, you can use your quirk. Izuku hummed and moved to stand in the circle. Alright, what do I have on hand that deals little damage, but a lot of knockback? His hair glowed, and the balls of light coalesced in his left hand, forming an iron sledgehammer. There's nothing against me hitting it after it's in the air, is there? Aizawa-sensei grinned. You heard me. The only rule is that you have to stay in the circle. Izuku felt a matching grin slide onto his face, and he tossed the ball up in the air. As it reached its zenith, he grabbed the handle with his other hand and lifted the hammer into the air behind him. As the ball fell down, Izuku swung low like he was playing golf, and the head of the hammer hit the ball at just the right angle. The ball streaked off into the distance, and Izuku allowed the hammer to settle onto his shoulder in the follow-through. The class gasped in surprise, while Katsuki merely crossed his arms and smirked. Eventually, the ball hit the ground on the other side of the field, and a device in Aizawa-sensei's hand beeped. He held it up to show a screen that read 698.3 meters. In order for me to properly train you all, I first need to know your limits. These tests are designed to find those limits. The class devolved into chatters, and the pink-skinned girl said, We get to use our quirks for this? This is gonna be fun. Immediately, Aizawa-sensei rounded on her, eyes narrowed. Fun? Is heroics just a game to you? The class fell silent. Fine, if you want to treat this like a game, then let's raise the stakes, shall we? Whoever comes in last place will be determined to have 0 potential, and will be expelled. The class devolved into shouting, and Ochako shouted, You can't do that! Izuku scoffed. He can, and he absolutely will if you don't give this your best effort. Aizawa-sensei is known for being strict, and he's expelled students in the past for not trying their hardest. Hell, last year, he expelled his entire class on the first day because they didn't take him seriously. Aizawa-sensei nodded. Exactly. I refuse to teach students with no potential or worse, students who refuse to use their potential. Heroics is not a game one wrong move, and your life is forfeit. I refuse to send a student out into the field, only to read their obituary in the paper the next day. Have I made myself clear? The quartet from Yuzudafu chorused. Yes, Aizawa-sensei. The rest of the class all voiced their assent soon after. The man nodded. Good. With that out of the way, let's get down to business. Since the ball throw was the one demonstrated, we'll start with that and go in order of seat number. Aoyama, you're up first. Katsuki rolled his shoulders and flexed his fingers as he prepared for the 50-meter dash. He was running alongside Izuku, and the nerd was going through some basic stretches. Stay out of my way, nerd. Izuku grinned. Only if you stay out of mine, Bomberanian. Katsuki smirked and walked up to the starting line, leaning forward. He was dimly aware of Izuku doing the same thing next to him. Aizawa-sensei called out, Midoriya, Bakugu, start. Immediately, Katsuki blasted off, his palms facing behind him and letting off one explosion at a time, maximizing his thrust and keeping him on course. There was a blur of wind beside him, and the nerd was suddenly standing at the other end of the track and facing backwards, wearing roller skates and holding what looked like a speaker turned into a gun. Katsuki streaked across the finish line only a second later, immediately grabbing Izuku and pulling him into a noogie. How come you never showed that speed during training, huh? Izuku snorted and pushed him off. Yeah, whatever. Kyuka crouched down at the end of the sandbox for the standing long jump. If I had any speakers, I could propel myself. But what can I do without them? Her jacks flew out and stabbed themselves into the ground a couple feet out, on either side of the sandbox. She glanced over at Aizawa-sensei, but he didn't say anything, just checking his tablet. Go ahead. She grinned, before turning her attention back to the sandbox. She jumped, her jacks pulling her forward and slightly adding to her momentum. She fell back down to earth just outside the sandbox, landing on her feet and stumbling for a meter or so. Aizawa-sensei merely smirked and tapped something out on his tablet, before calling for the next person. Fumikage hummed as he considered the measuring tool used for the grip strength test. It would be foolish to assume that having you grip it by yourself would not adhere to the spirit of the test. Dark Shadow sighed. Probably not. So what do we do? Fumikage rubbed at what approximated to his chin. You already slumber within my body, yes? Would it be possible to infuse your wings into my arms and add your strength to my own? Dark Shadow grinned. What the heck? Let's try it. Fumikage picked up the device, and Dark Shadow settled over him, feeling almost like a second skin. Fumikage wrapped a shadow-covered hand over the end of the tool and squeezed, and the bar came back much faster than if he'd done it on his own. Aizawa-sensei nodded in approval and motioned for the next person to come forward. Izuku walked off the track, having just finished the endurance run. He and the Yaoyorozu girl had lasted the longest, having both made devices to carry them, her with a moped, and him with his extreme gear. Kyuka was leaning against the wire fence, and she stepped forward, holding her arms out to him. He immediately pulled her into a hug, smirking at the loud noise of disgust from Mineta. When do you think he'll realize we do this specifically to piss him off? Kyuka snorted. The day his intelligence beats out his pride. Ah, so when hell freezes over. Gotcha. Aizawa-sensei cleared his throat, and the class turned their attention to him. Well, none of you did too poorly, so I can't exactly complain about that. As for your specific scores, he pulled out a hologram projector and turned it on, displaying a 10x2 table of names and numbers. First place had gone to Todoroki, who had dominated most of the tests with proficient use of his ice. Yaoyorozu had taken second place with Izuku in a close third, both of them having created various items to help them with their tests. Ida came in fourth and Katsuki was a close fifth. Sixth went to Ochako, seventh to Fumikage, and eighth to Kirishima. Kyuka had pulled a respectable 12th, and Mineta was sitting in 19th above Hagakure in 20th. Immediately, the invisible girl started sobbing, and Mineta smirked. Sucks to be you. Now I've got a good shot at some real lookers. Aizawa-sensei smirked. I wouldn't be too sure. The holographic display shimmered and switched to footage from one of the security cameras overlooking the training field. Mineta's face went pale as a video played of him grabbing Yaoyorozu's but from behind, only to dart off when she whirled in place with a fully formed taser in her hand. I wasn't judging last place on just your scores in the tests. I was also looking for clever thinking and proper behavior. The display went back to the table of scores. If I add in that little interaction, the two bottom spots switched places. Hagakure's score stayed the same, but Mineta's score had dropped to 0. The short boy went pale. You can't do that. Aizawa-sensei huffed. I believe Midoriya has established that I can and will. Have you forgotten? Nezu told you in your acceptance letter that you were admitted on probation. One wrong move and you're out. You already got your other 2 strikes at Mizudafu Junior High. This was strike 3. You're expelled. Get out of my sight. Mineta started crying and wailed. Mom will have your job for this. Aizawa-sensei chuckled darkly. Might you be referring to Mineta Karen, our former school board member? Mineta froze, the color draining from his face. What? Oh right, she probably hasn't had an opportunity to tell you yet. You see, somebody went around and collected records of every sexual harassment lawsuit that was filed against you. Interestingly enough, every single case was dropped due to insufficient evidence. Quite the odd consensus, especially considering the most recent one, occurring at the Kiyoshi Ward shopping mall, had clear video evidence of you and 2 others attempting to assault your helpless victim. As a result, your mother was fired from the school board just this morning. The hero glared down at the midget. My decision stands. You are expelled, Mineta Minoru. Mineta's face went white as a sheet, and he ran off towards the classroom, bawling his eyes out. The class watched him go, and a collective cheer rose up as he rounded a corner and vanished from sight. Aizawa-sensei continued, remember, the syllabi are on your desks back at the classroom. Make sure to look through them, since they have a map of the school and a list of facilities available to you as hero students. Izuku took Kyuka's hand in his and started heading back towards the classroom. As he passed by Hagakure, he paused and tossed her a thumbs up. Mom says you're welcome. Chapter 11. When Aizawa-sensei walked into class the following day, the room fell silent within seconds. He nodded with satisfaction. Good, you're already improving. Now, a few announcements. First of all, UA follows the same style as junior high. You will have your classes in your homeroom, with a different teacher for each subject. There will be a 5-minute break between periods to allow for trips to your lockers, which are located in the hallway by the stairwell. Morning classes are your academics, math, science, English, etc. The lunch period lasts for 1 hour, after which you will have 5 minutes to be back here for afternoon classes. Since you're in the hero course, those will usually be hero-related classes, such as foundational heroics or heroic law. Any questions? Nobody raised their hand. He nodded. All right. Secondly, we have a new staff member this year to help teach heroics classes to your year. He's new to teaching, but for some ungodly reason, he'll be in charge of your foundational heroics class today. Don't worry. I'll be nearby to hopefully prevent accidents. I want you to give him the same amount of respect that you would give any other teacher, no more, no less. We may be heroes, but while we're holding classes, we are to be treated as teachers. Understood. They chorused. Yes. Aizawa-sensei. He nodded. Good. Lastly, he turned towards the door. Come in. Hitoshi walked in to the quiet cheers of the hero hopefuls. Aizawa-sensei continued. As of this morning, Ayama Hitoshi is officially a hero course student. He had the highest score on the entrance exam for those who failed, so he was chosen to fill our empty seat. I'd better not find any of you treating him differently because he transferred from the general education course. He glanced up at the clock and sighed. That'll be all for today. Dismissed. In a move reminiscent of Chishiki-sensei, Aizawa-sensei walked out of the room and closed the door behind him right as the bell rang to signal the end of homeroom. Most of the class filtered out towards the lockers, but a portion of the students gathered around Izuku's desk. Kyuka casually leaned against the wall and said, "All right, so we're all in the Hero Hopeful server, which really needs a rebranding, now that I think about it. How about we all go around and introduce ourselves for real?" Izuku nodded. "Makes sense to me. Midoriya Izuku, aka Bush Boss, aka the guy who started this whole shindig." Katsuki smirked. "Bakugu Katsuki, aka King Explosion." Ochako raised her hand. "Uraraka Ochako, aka Newton Espagne." Hitoshi snorted. "Ayama Hitoshi, aka Insomnicat." Kaminari tossed up a mock salute. "Kaminari Denki, aka Sparky Way." The rock-headed boy tapped his fingers together. Kudakuji. "My username is Snow White." Kirishima knocked his fists together. "Kirishima Ijiru. Rock Riot." Kyuka twirled a jack around her finger. "Jiru Kyuka. Totally jacked." Izuku hummed. "So we're only missing Baby Gremlin and Mr. Twister. Have we heard anything from them since the school year started?" Katsuki, the more active of the two admins, shook his head. "Not a peep. Could be that they've been busy with school shit. But I know we were all trying for UA. Baby Gremlin does support shit, right? Maybe she's in the support course. Could be that Mr. Twister is in 1B, or maybe he went to Shiketsu for whatever reason. Somebody should ping him and ask." Izuku nodded. "I'll work on that during lunch, probably." He glanced over at where Koda was looking nervous, and he raised an eyebrow. "Koda, would you be more comfortable with sign language? Because I know for a fact that Katsuki, Kyuka, and I know JSL." Koda's eyes widened, and his hands started flying. "You really mean it? You're not gonna call me weird because I don't like to talk." Katsuki sighed. "I'm pretty sure we've all gone through some shit at some point in our lives. Eyebags was the villain kid. Izuku was the Quirkless Deku. Bose used to get teased because of her jacks. And I don't even know what kinds of shit the rest of you have gotten." Kirishima winced and rubbed at his neck. "Yeah, the other kids at school used to make fun of me, 'cause my quirk isn't very flashy. So when I said I wanted to be a hero, they kinda laughed at me." Katsuki groaned and dragged a hand down his face. "And here I thought I used to be a sack of shit. Your quirk is perfect for hero work. That level of tankiness is gonna get you places." Kaminari scoffed. "Well, at least he's good for more than just a single use. My quirk literally turns me into a brain-dead idiot when I discharge too much." Katsuki stared at the other blonde. "Then don't discharge? It's not that fucking complicated. If you can hold a steady current around your hands, then you're effectively a human taser. Figure out a fighting style to complement that, and you're golden." Kaminari held up a finger, then paused. "Wait, shit, it really is that simple. How the hell didn't I think of that before?" Kyuka scoffed. 100 yen that your teachers always said that bigger, flashier attacks were better for a hero. They really aren't. Heck, bigger attacks leave you more exhausted and more open to a counterattack. So it's better to keep your hits small and efficient." Ochako nodded and turned to Koda. "See? None of us are gonna hate you for not talking or how you look or what your quirk is. I can't relate to specifically being bullied, but I know what it's like to feel hopeless. My parents' construction company got cheated by one of our clients, and we were really strapped for cash for a while. We all make a habit of being nice to people in worse situations than us, because we know what it's like to be in a bad situation." Koda's eyes started filling with tears, and his hands flew too fast for even Izuku to decipher. The rest of the morning went by fairly normally. Sure, it was cool that they were being taught by pro heroes, but Aizawa-sensei was right that in these circumstances they were teachers, not pros. Of course, that didn't stop Izuku from internally geeking out every time a new one walked in. Their first class had been algebra with ectoplasm, who apparently liked to incorporate his quirk into his lessons. Different numbers of clones would pop up to go along with the numbers in the questions they were working through. In person, the hero was much more calm and friendly than his appearance would suggest. Kinda like Fumikage, if Izuku was being honest. Second period was modern literature with Cementos. Supposedly, he enjoyed sitting down with a nice cup of tea and a good book, and would always volunteer to help with rebuilding efforts, especially if a library had gotten caught in the crossfire. Izuku had approached him after class and recommended a pre-quirk author from America who specialized in various mythologies. Third period was English with present Mike. The blonde hero was apparently fluent, and would occasionally throw in random English phrases during his lessons. Izuku, of course, matched them all perfectly, and Mike was bursting with pride by the time the period had ended. At one point, they'd reenacted a fencing scene from a classic pre-quirk American movie, to Katsuki's amusement and everyone else's confusion. Their fourth morning class was cultural studies with Snipe. A fitting choice considering how much the hero knew about other cultures, especially American culture. Having been to several other countries throughout his career, Snipe was probably the most qualified to teach students about different cultures around the world. Personally, Izuku was impressed at how the hero managed a Texan accent in Japanese. Fifth period was rough, given that it was art history with midnight. Nearly every sentence was accompanied by a suggestive pose or innuendo, and it was really hard to focus on the work around those. Even the girls were having a hard time, though they were probably flustered rather than attracted. Then again, with how red Ochako was getting, it could have been both. Lunch followed shortly after. The cafeteria was thankfully easy to find, and the signs set up around the vast room helped prevent any collisions between students who were unsure of where to go. Lunch rush presided over the kitchen, whipping up anything a student requested in record time and with record quality. The line moved quickly, and 1A scattered among a group of available tables. Izuku and Kyuka obviously sat together, and they were quickly joined by Katsuki, Ochako, Fumikage, and Hitoshi. After the initial silent period where everyone dug into their lunch with relish, conversations started to spring up. Hitoshi asked, "So, Midoriya, I wasn't in the same testing center as you, so I didn't exactly get to see you show off. Dad was really impressed with your performance, though, and it got me curious. Namely, what's your quirk?" Izuku swallowed the bite of food he'd been chewing. "It's a stockpiling quirk that I call save file. Essentially, I can store up to 10 items that I've used in video games in a mental inventory. I can then manifest up to 4 items at a time, though more physics-breaking items take up more slots. For instance, my extreme gear that I used during the test yesterday takes up only 1 slot since it's fairly easy to recreate with technology, while something like the Ultra Sword I pulled out during the entrance exam took up 3 slots due to its size-changing properties. In addition, I equip items by creating them from the fat in my cells, so making really big items can drain me. That's why I usually stick to smaller items like my extreme gear, so that I still have the energy to fight." Hitoshi hummed. "Are there any things you just can't make at all?" "Yeah, anything that straight up breaks physics is a no-no, as is anything sentient. So, like, if I tried to store an infinity bow from Minecraft, it wouldn't work. Something like a max potion from Pokemon, however, I can store, but since it takes up 5 slots, I can't manifest it." Hitoshi whistled. "Damn, even with the limits, that's still a really useful quirk. Dad would call it versatile, but I think Pops would call it busted." Izuku shrugged. "Guess so. What about you?" Hitoshi's face fell and Izuku winced. "Sorry, tough subject." Hitoshi sighed. "Sorta. I've already told you that I used to be the villain kid. It's because of my quirk. It's called brainwashing. If someone responds to me, they lose control of their bodies and become heavily susceptible to my commands. Basically, I can order them to do whatever I want. I can control if it activates or not, but everybody around me ignored that fact and assumed I'd control them at every opportunity." Izuku winced. "Yikes. Also, the name is wrong. Brainwashing is defined as changing a person's thought process over a long time, usually with psychological torture, and it's a permanent change. Your quirk sounds more like putting someone in an enhanced version of a hypnotic state." Hitoshi grunted. "Wish I'd known that sooner. Well, hindsight's 20/20, I guess. What about you guys?" Katsuki held up his palm, sparks dancing across it. "My sweat has the same properties as nitroglycerin, and I can make it explode using sparks from my palms. I also have a mutation that makes me sweat a lot more than the average person, which is what allows me to make huge blasts." Kyuka twirled one of her jacks around her index finger. "I have these prehensile jacks hanging from my earlobes. They can extend up to about 3 meters out, and if I insert them into something, they can project my heartbeat. If I use speakers, I can actually shoot blasts of sound." Ochako set her pinky finger down on one of her chopsticks, letting it float above the table. "If I touch something with 5 fingers, I can essentially remove its gravity. My quirk counselor wasn't sure exactly how, and I've been studying physics on my own time to try and figure it out. I can cancel the effect by putting my fingers together." Dark Shadow popped out from Fumicage's shirt. "Hi, I'm Fumi's quirk. Just call me Dark Shadow. I get stronger in darkness, but I also have less control over myself. I think Fumi and I can also read each other's emotions, but we haven't done a lot of testing with that yet. And yes, I'm fully sentient." Izuku glanced over at the clock, and his eyes widened. "Crap. We've only got 5 minutes until the period's over." Conversations ceased as the table hurriedly scarfed down what was left of their lunches. Izuku was probably the fastest out of the 6 of them, even though he ate about twice as much as a normal person in order to fuel his quirk. They got back to class and back in their seats just as the bell rang to signal the start of afternoon classes. Izuku mused out loud. "Wonder who the new teacher might be? Maybe a rookie? Or a recent graduate?" Katsuki huffed. "Betcha it's someone in the top 10. UA doesn't settle for second best in anything." Any further speculation was cut off by familiar booming laughter from the hallway. "I am here." The door slid open, and All Might leaned in at a perfect 45-degree angle. Coming in through the door like a normal person, Izuku's eyes widened as the hero strutted to the teacher's podium. Kirishima excitedly whispered, "Holy crap, we get to be taught heroics by All Might?" Kyuka whispered back, "Don't get too excited. Aizawa-sensei did say that he was new to teaching. Watch him not have his certification and have only been allowed on staff because the HPSC would revolt otherwise." All Might seemingly ignored the whispered conversation, looking out over the class with a constant toothy grin. "Yes, indeed. I have joined UA's staff to help teach heroics classes to the first-year Hero Core students. Aizawa-sensei walked in and closed the door behind himself with a sigh. I asked for your first lesson to be in the second week, but no. Nedzu put you in charge of inexperienced first-years on the first day of classes when you haven't even gotten a teaching certification. Kyuka snorted and whispered, "Called it." All Might continued, "In any case, we'll be starting with the basics, and nothing is more basic than your costumes." With a flourish, he pressed a button on a remote, causing a section of panels to hiss away from the left wall, close to the board. "Your costumes are numbered the same as your seats. Get changed and get to the buses. Our first lesson takes place in Ground Beta." Chapter 12. Izuku rubbed his costume between his fingers as the class emerged from the tunnel into the fake city that was Ground Beta. All Might boomed. "They say the clothes make the hero, and you certainly look like heroes to me. Ladies and gentlemen." Izuku had gone with a costume that was equal parts substance and style. Elbow and knee pads, brass knuckles in his gloves, and boots with metal soles augmented his offensive capabilities, while the jumpsuit covering the rest of his body was made from the same material as most hero costumes, providing some defense against heat, cold, electricity, light impacts, and small cuts. Various pouches on his waist could hold medical supplies and snacks to fuel his quirk. The jumpsuit was forest green in color, while the gloves, pads, boots, and pouches were mostly black with dark green lines running along the seams. Completing the look was a stereotypical punk, sleeveless vest, looking like black leather with green metal rings around the armholes, along with a deep pocket on each side for extra storage. On the back was a green silhouette of a gaming controller, surrounded by a thick green circle. The collar was lined with black wool where it met his neck. In addition, there was a pair of black headphones with a green lightning pattern across the headband. There were also comical lightning bolts on the outsides of the ear cups, ringed by green circles. Normally, the decals glowed green, but Izuku was glad to see that the lights could be turned off. There was also a note left in his costume case, which read, "Hey there, Bush. I figured out it was you from recordings of the entrance exam, and you had better be thankful that I argued to be your costume designer and personal support technician. Just barely got privileges to work with King_Explosion and Totally_Jacked too. I made your jacket out of a special alloy that looks and feels like leather, but is almost as protective as a suit of armor. Come by the support workshops after classes today, and we can catch up." Baby Gremlin. Izuku had been psyched about meeting another member of the hero hopefuls, but Katsuki had managed to bring him back down to earth a bit. The blonde had reminded Izuku that they still had to get through whatever All Might had planned for foundational heroics, which had snagged Izuku's attention and gotten the green-haired boy to quickly get changed and get out to the bus. Though, as he stood in the road leading through Ground Beta, he had a few choice words for the other costume designers in the support course. Mainly viable protection and sexual harassment lawsuit. A majority of the girls were wearing skin-tight bodysuits, and while they were likely made of the same material as his jumpsuit, that didn't help their mobility or discomfort. At least Kyuka's costume was exactly how she designed it. Originally, she just planned on wearing a normal-looking shirt-jacket combo with pants and speaker boots, but after a few discussions with Izuku, she'd gone for a few upgrades. Her gloves carried brass knuckles in case she couldn't use her quirk, and had small, detachable speakers on the backs to give her easier access to sound blasts. Her headphones, like Izuku's, carried a comm system and were noise-canceling to block sound-based attacks from others. Her boots had retractable spikes to prevent her from being blown away by large-scale attacks or extreme wind, in addition to larger speakers than her gloves, and her jacket was apparently made of the same alloy as Izuku's. Katsuki's costume was almost exactly the same as he'd imagined it when he and Izuku were kids. A black tank top with an orange X over the chest, black pants with dark green straps, black boots with orange soles, white knee pads, green gloves with orange palms that somehow let his explosions come through, a black domino mask with spiked black and orange decals behind the ears, and a white neckpiece that helped compensate for the recoil of his explosions. However, after reconciling with Izuku, Katsuki had redesigned his grenade gauntlets. Before, they'd looked like typical frag grenades, with storage tanks that would accumulate his sweat and fire a massive explosion out of a hole in the pin, when full. Now, however, they looked more like flashbang grenades, and the storage tanks funneled into 3 barrels that would have less power than just the one, but were still more powerful than Katsuki's usual blasts. Before Izuku could think about his classmates' costumes any further, All Might boomed. "Now then, let's jump straight into today's lesson. Combat training." Ida stuck his hand up. "Sir, this looks similar to the fake cities from the entrance exam. Will we be performing mock cityscape battles again?" All Might laughed. "Not quite. Answer me this. Where do most villain fights take place?" Kaminari raised his hand cautiously. "Out on the street? Good guess, but no. While most televised fights are out in the open, a good majority will occur indoors. Most villains you fight will have some form of base, so it's good to learn these tactics early on." Ajui frowned. "Isn't this a bit early, Karo? Shouldn't we start with the basics first?" "These are the basics, young Asui. Now then." All Might reached into his pocket and pulled out a script of all things. Izuku could feel his respect for the man slipping. "The scenario is as follows. A team of 2 villains have procured a nuclear warhead and are currently holed up in this building to my right. A team of 2 heroes must go in and capture them. Teams have been assigned by random lottery, with 10 teams and 5 matches in total. Ida thrust his hand up again. Sir, is random lottery truly the best method of determining teams? Yaoyorozu hummed. Perhaps it is to simulate real-world situations? Most heroes do not get the opportunity to choose their partner when in a crisis like this. All Might beamed, and Izuku knew for a fact the hero was lying through his teeth as he said, "Precisely, young Yaoyorozu. Now, the villain teams will each have 5 minutes to prepare. After that time is up, the heroes will be permitted to enter the building, after which they will have 10 minutes to either capture the villains or secure the bomb to win. If the villains capture both heroes or defend the bomb until time runs out, then the villains win." All Might glanced around, as though he was expecting someone to speak up with a question. After a few seconds of silence, the hero cleared his throat. Yes, well, in any case, here are the teams for the exercise. Team A, Kaminari Denki and Jiru Kyuka. Team B, Todoroki Shuto and Ojiro Mashireo. Team C, Hagakure Toru and Ayama Hitoshi. Team D, Kirishima Ijiru and Yaoyorozu Momo. Team E, Bakugu Katsuki and Azui Tsuyu. Team F, Shiro Hanta and Satu Rikidu. Team G, Kuda Kuji and Shuji Mezu. Team H, Uraraka Ochako and Midoriya Izuku. Team I, Ashido Mina and Tokoyami Fumikage. Team J, Aoyama Yuga and Ida Tenya. Without being asked, the hero hopefuls immediately formed up with their respective team members. Kaminari and Kyuka shared a chuckle at the similar-looking outfits. Hagakure looked confused when Hitoshi walked up to her, but quickly shrugged it off. Similarly, Yaoyorozu seemed anxious when Kirishima walked over to her, but his sunshine nature quickly eased her worries. Azui seemed a little uneasy about being partnered with Katsuki, and the blonde did little to change that with his crossed arms. Kuda walked over to the large form of Shuji, who turned out to be quite fluent in JSL. Ochako and Izuku grinned at each other as they moved closer, with Izuku already mentally running through possible matchups and counters. The rest of the class watched, before they quickly followed their examples and got into their assigned pairs. Ojiro already wore an annoyed expression as Todoroki didn't move an inch, forcing the blonde to walk over to his partner. Shiro immediately started discussing possible strategies with Satu, the two having stood close together by coincidence. Ashido was practically bouncing in place, and Fumikage merely chuckled as he faded into the background of her exuberant personality. Aoyama and Ida moved together, the former striking a pose and causing the latter to start chopping his arm. Once everyone had gotten into their teams, All Might cleared his throat and drew their attention. Yes. Well, in any case, let's get to deciding the first matchup. 2 boxes on wheels seemingly appeared out of nowhere, one black and one white. All Might ruffled around in both for a little while, before pulling something out of each and opening his hands to reveal a black ball in one hand and a white ball in the other. Team B as the heroes will face Team D as the villains. Those not participating, follow me to the observation booth. Ijiru smacked his fists together a few times as Yaoyorozu started setting up defenses around the room they chose to hide the bomb in. So, I'll admit I don't know much about strategy. If you need someone to tank hits and punch hard, I'm your guy. But you seem like you know how to make a good plan. So, what's going through that big brain of yours? Yaoyorozu hummed. Well, I went through the recommendations exam and so did Todoroki. His usual modus operandi seems to be the same as his performance during the Quirk apprehension test yesterday. Ijiru frowned. So, overwhelming force with his ice? Yaoyorozu nodded. Indeed. So, I believe that his first move will be to freeze the entire building. He most likely believes that such a move would let him win almost instantly. Ijiru grinned. But we're going to prove him wrong, aren't we? Yaoyorozu shrugged. Maybe. It all depends on how strong you are with your quirk activated. If you were frozen up to your shoulders, do you think you would be able to break free? Ijiru smirked and hardened his fists, slamming them together and producing a spray of sparks. You bet. She nodded. Good. Then we have a fighting chance. All Might's voice rang out over the loudspeakers. Your 5 minutes of prep time are up. Heroes, you may enter the building. Ijiru glanced out the window of the room, noticing Ojiro trying to talk to his partner, while Todoroki just stared up at the building. Heads up, Yao. I think Todoroki might be trying to do this by himself. Yaoyorozu winced. Todoroki-kun never liked to work with others. Unfortunately, he is strong enough to act on his own more often than not, which tends to reinforce that way of thinking. Be ready. Ijiru watched Todoroki lay his hand on the outer wall of the building, and he braced himself. As expected, ice came rushing out from the hallway, freezing the entire room within an instant. Ijiru grinned and hardened his legs, the sudden protrusions on his joints cracking the ice enough for him to pull himself free. He frowned, noticing how slippery the floor was. That might be a problem. Yaoyorozu hummed, melting herself free with a blowtorch. If you hardened just your fingers, would they become spikes? Ijiru's eyes widened. He released his hardening on his fists and opened his hands, reactivating his quirk and watching his fingers harden into durable, but still flexible, rocky spikes. Yao, you're a genius. If I stab these into the walls, I can get around without much problem. He carefully made his way towards the door, before glancing back at his partner. I'll try not to get too far from the bomb room, just in case I need you to get me loose for more ice. Just because I broke free this time doesn't mean I'll be guaranteed to another time. You know? She nodded. I understand. I will prepare in the meantime. Izuku grinned and walked out into the hallway, hearing her set up metal barricades by the door behind him. Taking a deep breath, he headed towards the stairwell he'd noticed in his initial sweep. It took longer than he expected for Todoroki to reach the 5th floor, the other boy's breath already coming out in visible puffs. Wow, losing steam already, Todoroki? I was hoping you'd be able to put up more of a fight by the time you reached me. But you're totally exhausted before we've even started, the two-toned boy huffed. It doesn't matter. You won't break free again. Stand aside, or I will be forced to freeze you solid. Izuku rolled his eyes, his legs already hardening in preparation. No can do, bro. Right now, I've got to hold the line for my partner. And I wouldn't be able to call myself a man if I couldn't hold back one half-dead popsicle. Todoroki's eyes narrowed, and he stomped forward with his right foot. Ice shot forward, but Izuku was prepared. He launched himself to the side, leaving a crater in the ice where he'd been standing and just barely getting out of the way of the attack in time. Todoroki's eyes widened in shock, but Izuku didn't pause. Digging his hardened fingers into the frozen wall, he launched himself forward towards his opponent. Already worn out from freezing the building, Todoroki couldn't move as Izuku slammed into him, sending the two-toned boy flying into a wall. Izuku ran forward, pulling the capture tape out of his back pocket and quickly wrapping it around Todoroki's arms and legs. He nearly balked at how cold the other boy's right side was, but he brushed it aside, stepping back once Todoroki had been properly restrained. All Might's voice rang out. Young Todoroki has been captured by the villains. 5 minutes remain in the match. Izuku carefully made his way back to the bomb room, poking his head in to see Yaoyorozu looking out the window. Has Ojiro really been standing outside this whole time? She nodded. It would appear Todoroki ordered his partner to stay outside while he attempted to take on the both of us. A poor decision on his part, apparently, considering you managed to take him down by yourself. Izuku huffed. He was already half frozen by the time he got to the 5th floor. He probably would have had a better chance if he hadn't used most of his strength freezing the entire building first. Yaoyorozu inhaled sharply, before turning away from the window. Ojiro has entered the building. I doubt he'll be as hindered by the cold, considering his tactic for the standing long jump yesterday. I again ask you to stand guard by the stairwell. Izuku nodded. Right? Here's hoping he doesn't have any crazy tricks up his lack of sleeves. He launched himself back down the hallway, skidding to a stop by the stairwell by jamming his fingers into the ice on the floor. It tore up the ice behind him, which was good for him, since it meant less slippery footing for going against Ojiro. The boy in question had just launched himself up the center of the stairwell by wrapping his tail around the railing above him, flinging himself up to the 5th floor remarkably quickly. Ojiro landed in front of Izuku, quickly settling into a stance that the redhead recognized as some form of martial art. Surrender now. I'd rather not fight if I don't have to. Izuku shrugged, banging his fists together and causing sparks to fly. Well, too bad. You have to. Ojiro made the first move, springing forward with a fist aimed at Ijuru's face. He crossed his arms, blocking the move and sliding back a few inches. Ojiro followed up with a roundhouse and a tail smack, each blow causing Izuku to slide back further and further. The other teen was relentless, not giving the redhead an opportunity to drop his guard for even a moment. However, Izuku knew it was far from one-sided. His hardening was holding strong, and while he was still getting knocked back, he was sliding less and less with each consecutive blow. In addition, Ojiro was quickly starting to tire, as the blows were getting marginally slower and weaker as time passed. Ojiro grunted as he put all his strength into one final tail smack, managing to shove Izuku back a meter or so. Unfortunately for the blonde, that gave Yaoyorozu just enough space to fire a marble-sized ball of steel from a slingshot, bouncing off the wall and beating Ojiro right in the forehead. The other boy stumbled, off balance, and Izuku struck. Dropping his guard, he leapt forward, his left arm coming out and hooking around Ojiro's neck. Izuku kicked his feet out, falling to the floor and bringing his opponent down with him. As Ojiro's back slammed into the floor, his breath was driven from his lungs in one explosive hoof. Immediately, Yaoyorozu ran forward and wrapped her own capture tape around the blonde's arms and legs. All Might's voice rang out. Young Ojiro has been captured. The villain team wins. Izuku watched as Kirishima and Yaoyorozu walked into the observation room, the former grinning triumphantly and the latter smiling softly. Todoroki and Ojiro limped into the room afterwards, the latter glaring at the former, who just ignored his partner. All Might boomed. A good match on both sides. Now, can anyone determine who was the most valuable in this match? Izuku said. It was close between Kirishima and Yaoyorozu. An interesting claim, young Midoriya, All Might declared. Would you care to explain your reasoning? Well, the villain team had one big advantage over the hero team cooperation. Kirishima and Yaoyorozu actually worked together and formed a plan, whereas Todoroki insisted on trying to do everything himself and outright ordered his partner to stay outside. The teen in question glared at him, but Izuku soldiered on. More importantly, Yaoyorozu knew how her opponent was most likely to act, and devised a plan to counteract that. Meanwhile, both Todoroki and Ojiro appeared to think that they could simply overpower their opponents. Most of the class nodded their agreement, and Yaoyorozu blushed. All Might boomed. Very true, young Midoriya. Many villains will either attempt to steamroll heroes with raw power, or will resort to deceit and underhanded tricks in an attempt to succeed. It is important to know if brute force or a good strategy is the better option. Internally, Izuku scoffed. The man wouldn't know a plan if it walked up to him and kicked him in the dick. The hero continued, in any case, let US determine the teams for the next match. Reaching into the 2 boxes, he ruffled around for a bit, before pulling out 2 balls. Team C as the villains will face Team G as the heroes. Chapter 13. Hitoshi hummed to himself as he and Hagakure mentally prepared themselves for the coming match. So, Dad let me watch some of the footage of the Quirk apprehension test, and while I think I've got a good idea of what Shuji can do, I'm drawing a blank on Kuda. Got anything? Hagakure rubbed at her chin. I think he talks to animals and stuff. For the ball throw, he got a bird to carry the ball as far as it could. He also doesn't like talking out loud all that much, and I think he's too shy to really fight anyone else. Hitoshi frowned. If he felt up to fighting, I'd be concerned, since his lack of talking doesn't bode well for my Quirk, since I need a verbal response for it to work. Unfortunately, Shuji's pretty strong and he doesn't seem to talk all that much either. Any ideas? Hagakure sighed. Unfortunately, I'm flat out of luck. Our only real chance is if you somehow get Shuji to respond. I'll support however I can, but I'm not exactly in the fittest shape. She shivered and brushed at her legs. Man, did the costume guys really not have a way to give me an actual costume? Just wearing gloves and boots is super uncomfy. Hitoshi scowled. Any designer worth their salt would know better than that. I'm hauling you to the support department later for a redesign. Any further discussion was cut off when All Might announced, your 5 minutes of prep time are up. Heroes, you may enter the building. The building was suddenly swarmed by a flood of rats. Hitoshi went pale as the furry critters flowed across the floor, and Hagakure shrieked in terror as they were pushed over by the tide of rodents. After a minute or so of darkness and fur, the rats shifted to clear their faces, but still weighed down their bodies and kept them trapped in place. Kuda walked in the door, followed by Shuji. The shorter boy signed, sorry, but I didn't want this to drag out too long, and I wanted to be useful. Apologies if this brings up bad memories or something. Kuda walked over and laid his hand on the prop. All Might's voice boomed, the bomb has been secured. Hero team wins. Izuku grinned as Kuda walked into the room, followed by his partner and the villain team. Izuku tossed his friend a thumbs up, before focusing his attention back to All Might. The hero announced, quite the interesting match. Now, who was the MVP here? Yaoyorozu raised her hand. It had to be Kuda-kun, sir. He restrained both villains almost immediately and without causing damage to the building. Shuji-kun did carry his weight by informing his partner of the bomb's location, but Kuda-kun did end up doing most of the work. The villain team suffered a massive disadvantage. Kuda-kun's tendency to use sign language and Shuji-kun's quiet nature meant that Ayama-kun's quirk would not be usable, and Hagakure-chan's low physical strength would not have helped her much if Shuji-kun had been the one fighting. However, neither had much of a counter to being trapped underneath a literal army of rats, which honestly seems like a bit of an oversight on Yue's part to have such a thriving colony in the training ground. Izuku snorted. 100 yen says that Nedzu lets them stay as long as they don't interfere with classes. All Might cleared his throat. A wise assessment, young Yaoyorozu. Now, let US determine the teams for the 3rd match. He ruffled around in the 2 boxes again, before bringing out 2 more balls. Team J as the heroes will face Team I as the villains. Fumikage hummed to himself as his partner began dissolving the floor around the bomb. So, if we are to cooperate fully, we should be aware of each other's capabilities. My quirk is a sentient creature of shadow, growing stronger and more violent in darkness, yet weaker but more controlled in light. You, Ashido giggled. I make acid. I can control how corrosive or viscous it is when I'm producing it, and my skin's immune to it, but beyond that, I can't really control it once it's out. Dark shadow appeared from underneath Fumicage's cloak. You know, we've never really tested what all I'm immune to or not. We already know that blades don't really cut me, and I'm pretty resistant to temperature, but we haven't had a chance to test acid. Ashido frowned. I dunno. What if something goes wrong? Fumikage nodded. I agree with Ashido-san. It would not be wise to test your immunities when we do not have a healer on hand in the event that things go awry. Perhaps Izuku could reserve a gym later that we could experiment in with Recovery Girl on standby. Ashido grinned. Oh, what's this? You already know our resident bush boy? Do tell. Fumikage huffed. We attended the same junior high for 2nd and 3rd year. We became friends after he stood up to an upperclassman who was bullying me. He has given us several creative uses and many questions that we have not yet answered. Ashido giggled. You're gonna have to tell me more later. Right now, though, we've got an exercise to get through. Fumikage nodded. Right, their quirks are quite dangerous, but I believe we can find ways to counter them. Aoyama-kun's laser is bright, but slow enough to avoid, so your agility should be able to let you dodge it. Ida-kun's engines make him quite fast, but speed is not much of an issue when Dark Shadow can grow large enough in darkness to block an entire hallway. Ishido grinned. So, I go for Aoyama, you prioritize Ida? Sounds good to me, though I noticed that most of these hallways have a lot of lights in them, and not a lot of light switches. What are you gonna do about that? Fumikage smirked and fingered the disc on his belt underneath his cloak. Izuku has shown me the value of working in the darkness, and Dark Shadow has trained to keep their emotions under control. Do not worry about us. Focus on your opponent. Ishido chuckled as the two of them stepped out into the hallway, having just finished melting most of the floor around the prop bomb. Sure thing, partner. Let's do this. All Might's voice rang out. Your prep time is over. Heroes, you may now enter the building. Fumikage jumped down the stairwell, Dark Shadow settling on top of his arms and allowing him to catch the railing on the second floor. Ishido leaped down after him, and Dark Shadow caught her in a large, dark claw, depositing her on the third floor. She gave him a two-fingered salute before running off down the hallway. Fumikage chuckled to himself before proceeding down the hall on his floor. Reaching under his cloak, he removed the disc from his belt and tossed it upwards. It latched onto one of the ceiling lights as expected and hung there, ready to be activated at any time. Fumikage moved towards the end of the hallway, using Dark Shadow's claws to remove a section of wall from the side and shifting it so that it blocked the window, leaving the ceiling lights as the only light source in the entire hall. He quickly walked back towards the stairwell, just in time to see Aoyama be launched up to the third floor. Ida slid to a stop on the second floor landing, pointing in Fumicage's direction. Halt, foul villain. Your plan will not succeed. We heroes will stop you. Fumikage smirked, allowing Dark Shadow's form to cover his head, giving the appearance of a second set of glowing yellow eyes. Then by all means, hero, come and face this child of darkness. We will not allow ourselves to be dragged into the light so easily. Ida dashed forward, already starting to deliver a wide kick with his right leg. Dark Shadow removed their arm from Fumikage, coming out just enough to block the blow. Stumbling for only a moment, Ida followed up with another kick. Fumikage jumped back, allowing the attack to hiss through the empty air. Ida laid on the pressure, forcing Fumikage towards the rear end of the hallway. Surrender now, villain. You have nowhere to run or hide. Fumikage smirked. Bold of you to assume we are running. Ida's leg swung out in another roundhouse kick, and Fumikage jumped forward. He soared over Ida's head, turning in midair and skidding backwards towards the end of the hallway. He shut the door to the stairwell as Ida turned to face him. Bold move, villain. But you have just cornered yourself again. Fumicage's smirk widened. I'm not trapped in here with you. He pressed the button on his belt, and the disc stuck to the ceiling let out an electromagnetic pulse. The lights in the hallway cut out, plunging the room into complete darkness. As Dark Shadow covered Fumicage's face, his vision was tinted red, and the form of his opponent was visible, clear as day. You're trapped in here with me. Izuku whistled in admiration as Fumikage and Dark Shadow wailed on Ida, never letting up for even a second. Damn, they're terrifying when they cut loose. Good thing Dark Shadow trained to keep their emotions under control in the dark. Fumikage lunged, grabbing Ida's face and dragging the other teen with him, before slamming his opponent into the wall at the end of the hallway. As Fumikage stepped back, Ida slumped to the ground, either unconscious or too battered to keep standing. Fumikage pressed another button on his belt, and the EMP on the ceiling deactivated, allowing the lights to turn back on. Dark Shadow retreated under Fumicage's cloak, and the boy stepped forward, wrapping his capture tape around Ida's legs. As All Might announced Ida's defeat, Izuku switched his attention to the screen showing Aoyama's fight with Ishido. The blonde wasn't doing well, already showing signs of stomach pain as the pink-skinned girl skated around his blasts without a single scratch on her. As Ishido ducked around another shot, she sped past Aoyama with barely an inch between them. The boy's belt suddenly fell away from his armor, and what looked like droplets of light started oozing out of the blonde's belly button. Aoyama frantically started scrabbling at the ground, his visor apparently not doing his vision any favors as he tried to find his belt. Ishido slid over and wrapped her capture tape around the blonde's arms, before picking up the belt and reattaching it to his waist. Aoyama sobbed with relief and wrapped her in a hug, and she awkwardly patted his head as All Might declared the villain team the winners. A few minutes later, the four students walked into the observation room, wearing expressions of triumph and defeat. All Might boomed. A stellar performance. Now, who would you say the MVP was this match? Yaoyorozu spoke up. I would say that both Tokoyami-kun and Ishido-chan were the MVPs. They clearly planned out who would deal with which hero from the start, and both developed plans to counter their respective opponents. Tokoyami-kun trapped Ida-kun in a narrow hallway where speed would not do him much good, and disabled the lights in order to power up his quirk to increase his advantage. Ishido-chan outmaneuvered Aoyama-kun's laser and wore him out, before removing the belt that he needs for his quirk in order to cripple her opponent and secure her win. In addition, the villains cut off easy access to the bomb ahead of time, which meant that even if the heroes had gotten past them, it would still be well defended. Izuku nodded along with the explanation, and the rest of the class voiced their assent. Ishido grinned and held up her hand, and Fumikage smirked and returned the high five. Ida removed his helmet with a sullen expression, and Aoyama patted his teammate on the back before heading towards a silent corner of the room. All Might announced. Very well. Now, let's see who will be our teams for the fourth match. He ruffled around in the boxes for a bit, before pulling out 2 balls. Team A as the heroes will face Team E as the villains. Katsuki checked over his gauntlets, noting that the firing mechanism looked functional, but thankfully wasn't active, meaning there wasn't a chance he could misfire and seriously harm the other team or the building. So, Frogger, we're up against a girl who hears practically everything and a guy who's a walking taser. Thoughts? She frowned. I'd prefer if you called me Tsu, or at least my name, Karo. Katsuki winced. Sorry, I can't connect names to faces for shit. I'm working on it. She sighed. Fine, Karo. So, Jiru-chan has really good hearing, and Kaminari-kun generates electricity. Right? Katsuki nodded. Bose also has a few speakers on her costume, and if she plugs her jacks into them, she can blast sound waves. I probably shouldn't go against Pikachu, since his electricity can detonate my sweat. That, and I know more about Bose's fighting style than I do about Pikachu's. Granted, that's assuming he has a fighting style at all. From what I know, he's in the habit of using huge blasts that make him go brain dead if he uses too much juice. Think you can handle that? His partner hummed. I think I remember something from my junior high science classes about electricity being more effective on something that's grounded, Karo. And I'm really good at jumping. Katsuki grinned and snapped the handles into place on his gauntlets. Gotcha. Blast. Jump. Profit. She nodded. Let's do this, Karo. All Might's voice rang out. Your 5 minutes of prep time are up. Heroes, you may now enter the building. Katsuki headed for the door, before pausing and glancing back at his partner. I'm gonna make some noise, try and draw their attention. I'll see if I can herd Pikachu your way while keeping Bose with me. She nodded. Get moving, Karo. Katsuki grinned and blasted off, quickly finding the stairwell and plummeting down to the bottom floor. See, just looking at Katsuki's costume, you'd think all of the padding would be in his upper body, to compensate for the recoil of his explosions. In truth, his boots also needed braces for his legs and feet, so that any decently sized blast wouldn't send him flying backwards. As a result, the impact from dropping 5 stories in his costume was equivalent to dropping about a foot in regular clothing. As Katsuki blasted off towards the front door, he thought to himself, Gremlin really knows her stuff when it comes to support gear. I gotta thank her for the boots and braces. He rounded the corner, grinning maniacally as Bose and Pikachu suddenly put up defensive stances when they saw him. Well, isn't this precious? A couple of twinsies decide they want to get in my business. Tough luck, heroes. Pikachu stuttered out. Where's the bomb, villain? Katsuki's grin widened. Right fucking here. He blasted forward, aiming an explosion at Pikachu's chest. The guy shrieked and covered himself in electricity, and Katsuki halted, the blast stopping mere inches from the other boy's shirt. He grabbed Pikachu by the neck and chucked him towards the stairwell. Come on. I thought heroes were better than this. Give me a challenge. He nimbly leaned back to avoid the jacks stabbing through the air at his face. Bose shouted, Kaminari, go. The bomb's gotta be on the top floor. I'll hold him back. Pikachu quickly gathered himself and ran up the stairs, and Katsuki grinned. Are you sure about that? Now you're all alone against the big bad Bakugu. You should have kept your partner with you so that you had a fighting chance. Bose smirked, and her jacks plugged into the speakers on her gloves. She banged her fists together, and Katsuki grinned wider at the clear sound of the brass knuckles underneath. Come on, Blasty. You're mine. Katsuki let out a bark of laughter. Wouldn't have it any other way. Izuku watched with anticipation as his girlfriend and best friend traded blows back and forth on the ground floor. Glancing over at the other screens, he could see Kaminari standing outside the bomb room, seemingly trying to psych himself up. Izuku quickly turned his attention back to the duel between Kyuka and Katsuki. She was giving the blonde a run for his money, able to displace his explosions with sound waves from her speakers, and every time she landed a punch, she would let out blasts of sound that Izuku knew for a fact were steadily dealing damage to Katsuki. Of course, Katsuki was dangerous both with and without his explosions, and she was forced to avoid his punches, kicks, and knee strikes. A sudden flash from one of the other monitors grabbed his attention. Kaminari was currently fighting Azui, his hands covered in electricity as he threw clumsy punches. The frog girl was clearly more in her element, able to easily outmaneuver her opponent and get through his poor defenses. Azui darted behind Kaminari and lashed out with her tongue, looking like she was going to wrap it around him. Immediately, Kaminari's whole body lit up with electricity, but it had been a feint. Azui's tongue whipped away from Kaminari, and she leapt from the ceiling, putting a good bit of distance between herself and her opponent. After a few seconds, the discharge cut off, and Kaminari stood there with a dazed expression. Azui quickly darted forward and wrapped her capture tape around her opponent. All Might announced, young Kaminari has been captured. Immediately, Kyuka redoubled her efforts against Katsuki, her faster heart rate increasing the strength of her sound waves. Her punches started flying faster, and Katsuki was forced to go on the defensive as he ducked and weaved around her attacks. Her fist flew towards his face, and he was forced to catch it in his hand. A sound wave blasted Katsuki into the stairwell, crashing through the railing and leaving a crater in the wall. Kyuka ran into the stairwell and glanced upwards. She raised her fist and, to the gasps of the other students, punched the floor. Another sound wave blasted out, and the recoil sent her flying up to the top floor in seconds. In midair, she let out another sound wave that sent her flying into the hallway leading to the bomb room. Hyuka ran forward, hand outstretched as Katsuki blasted around the corner, changing directions on a dime and heading towards Hyuka. Izuku clenched his fists tighter as Hyuka turned around and let out another sound wave, simultaneously forcing Katsuki back and propelling herself forward just enough for her to smack her hand into the bomb. All Might boomed. The bomb has been secured. The hero team wins. Hyuka stumbled into the observation room about a minute later, exhausted but grinning. Izuku immediately ran over and pulled her into a hug, causing All Might to blush while a few wolf whistles rose from the crowd. You did good, she smirked. Of course I did. You gave me the idea for soundboxing style after all. What, you didn't have faith in me? Izuku shrugged. Faith is one thing. Going up against Katsuki is a totally different thing. Hyuka chuckled. Fair enough. All Might cleared his throat. Yes. Well, in any case, let us decide who will take which role for the final match. He took out the black box and ruffled around in it for a while, before pulling out a black ball with the letter F on it. Team F as the villains will face Team H as the heroes. Hyuka gave Izuku a quick peck on the cheek. Good luck out there. And I better not catch you doing some hanky-panky with Ochako while I'm not there to kick some sense into your ass. Izuku grinned and returned the kiss, before pulling his headphones up over his ears, nodding at Ochako, and heading outside towards the assigned building. The 3-part is finished. If you missed the earlier chapters, don't worry. Head to the playlist and catch up now. Remember to support the author. Your support means everything. I'll be back with more soon. So stay tuned. Thank you for being absolutely awesome.